Okay, Peter, so we're here to talk about Whyte Povetkin 2, and obviously it's not very long ago we were talking about Whyte Povetkin 1. Interestingly, in that prediction analysis, I said I thought it was a very 50-50 fight. You know, Povetkin was always dangerous. In the last couple of years, he's always been underestimated and always carries that danger and that knockout power. And then we saw what happened with Whyte. You know, he looked like he was dominating the fight, 2 knockdowns in the 4th round, and then Povetkin came flying out for the 5th round and caught Whyte up against the ropes with that left uppercut and, you know, a brutal knockout. So we've now heard, you know, Eddie Hearn has announced that the rematch is going to go ahead on the 21st of November. So he's going straight back in there, which, to be fair to Whyte, was what he said, you know, literally when he got himself off the canvas, said, I want a rematch. You know, he couldn't believe it had happened to him. You know, the feeling was maybe he'd rolled the dice one too many times, taking all these hard fights, waiting in this perennial #1 contender position that he's been in famously for over 1,000 days. So looking at this rematch, there's a couple of question marks over the rematch initially. Incidentally, Whyte doesn't have a license to box at the moment. He's been suspended by the British Boxing Board of Control after that knockout, and there will be some tests that he will have to pass to box again in 3 months' time on the 21st of November. But, you know, they've already said that they're fully expecting to pass those tests. So let's say that gets the go-ahead. Then it's the venue. So Eddie Hearn said at the time they were thinking about the Royal Albert Hall and they were thinking about Wembley Arena, depending on the crowds. That was about 6 days ago when Eddie said that. And with this ever-changing COVID situation, it maybe looks like we won't have crowds back in November. So, you know, he's not going to want to book the Royal Albert Hall without a crowd. So where's he going to put it on? It's going to be too cold to do the Matchroom Garden again. You know, I would think that the York Hall is a brilliant solution. It's this sort of spiritual home of British boxing. It's a small, compact venue, which makes it so great when you're in there as a crowd. You know, you feel you can reach out and touch the fighters. But it's you know, it's a BT Sport have been doing a lot of shows from there with Frank Warren, and it looks, you know, it's a really good venue, and I think that would be an ideal no crowd venue. But anyway, we go on to Whyte boxing on the 21st, and I think the few things to look at, Peter. Obviously, we need to look at the individual situation, but looking at the broader picture, what happens in immediate rematches? Well, the general rule of thumb is what happens in immediate rematches. If you go back through boxing history, you get the same result. It's just a little bit more emphatic. So if you look at maybe Patterson-Liston 1, or you know, more recently, if you look at you know, Tony Thompson against David Price, or if you look at even Froch Groves, you know, you've had the result in the first match, which has kind of been underlined in the second match a little bit more emphatically. That said, there are exceptions to that rule. You know, and we've got to look at, you know, obviously Anthony Joshua recently went in 6 months after boxing Andy Ruiz and, you know, gave him a bit of a boxing lesson over 12 rounds, whereas he was obviously stopped, you know, and mauled in the first fight. So that was quite an impressive showing and got AJ back to his #1 position. You know, and going back beyond that, Lennox Lewis famously has been hit, and this is maybe a better example because Lewis against McCall was hit with that punch from McCall, you know, that almost that one punch. I don't like to call it a lucky punch because you've got to remember Sasha Povetkin is trained to throw that punch his whole life, you know, and has been throwing it. So I don't like to call it a lucky punch, but it just landed perfectly on Whyte. But Lewis against McCall had a similar thing. You know, he had that lightning strike with McCall, lost to McCall. Incidentally, he didn't rematch McCall for another few years. He actually went to Emmanuel Stewart, who was in McCall's corner for that fight, and got him to sort of really work on Lewis, iron out some of those flaws. And when he eventually fought McCall, he was still very wary of McCall, and McCall famously had that strange breakdown in the ring, but he did win convincingly. Lennox did go for an immediate rematch against Hasim Rahman when Rahman knocked him out in 5. But the reason Lennox blamed that, now that again was a one-punch thing, you know, in the 5th round. But Lewis blamed that on under preparation. He'd been filming Ocean 7. It was at altitude. He hadn't trained at altitude, whereas Rahman had. But in the rematch, Lewis was devastating. He was really on his game. It was a different Lennox Lewis. There was nothing laid back about this guy. He came out and destroyed Rahman. So, you know, there are precedents for a fighter saying, look, I just wasn't switched on in the first fight, and the second fight, I'm really going to bring my A game. And that's what Lewis did. The thing with Whyte is insisting this was a lightning strikes thing. He was doing well in the fight. He was dominating the fight. His camp was good, he said. Obviously, we've got the question mark over him switching trainers just before the fight. You know, he dropped Mark Tibbs, who had had that amazing run of victories with, you know, hard-fought victories in favour of Xavier Miller, and then he brought in Dave Caldell a few days before the fight. But Whyte says it was all great. Whyte says the camp was great, the trainers were great, the relationships were good. He'd gone straight back in. I think he had a week off. He's gone straight back to Portugal to get in training for this next fight. So, you know, he says he's going to reverse it. Now, you know, you've got to say in a way, after such a brutal knockout, is it wise to go back in, you know, with just 12 weeks? I mean, the question mark is, does he need to do that? I mean, the other thing is, if you look at the heavyweight situation, we've already said Whyte was banging on that door for 1,000 days. He was the perennial #1 contender. But that kind of put him a little bit ahead of the rest of the chasing pack, I thought. You know, you've got the three at the top, with Joshua Wilder and Fury. And I think they're going to be locked up with each other because, interestingly enough, after all we talked about, where's Deontay and all that sort of stuff, Fury tweeted the other day, my next fight will be against Deontay Wilder, wherever it is, whenever it is. So he seems nailed on for that. The WBC have also said they would be very interested in a Fury-Joshua fight after that. But I think that freezes anyone out other than the top three for a title shot against any of those top three for those belts until 2022. So why is Whyte in a rush? Well, you know, I think the answer is he's got to keep himself relevant. Like I say, it was almost like you had those three at the top, then you had Whyte, then you had the rest of the chasing pack. Obviously, that loss to Povetkin has put him back down into that pack. So, you know, to stay relevant and to stay knocking on the door, he needs to continue to occupy that #1 WBC contender spot, which Sasha Povetkin has now taken from him. So, you know, he's rushing back into this. And it's a real must-win for him. You know, you've got to say, fair play to Dillian, he's always shown he's the warrior. Since that first loss to Joshua, he's taken the hard route and he's deservedly got to his #1 spot and deserves his shot. And to have that taken away from him now, you know, you could argue that maybe he's rolled the dice once too often, but, you know, he needs to get that back. If he has a second loss to Povetkin, I don't think he will ever get that world title shot. If he has a second loss to Povetkin, he'll become, I think, a bit of a Derek Chisora gatekeeper heavyweight. Somebody that can't quite, is very, very good, very tough, give anyone a hard fight, but maybe can't cut it at the elite level. So there's a lot to play for Whyte here to prove that he's world level, go straight back in at world level and get it back. You know, one thing that did strike me going into this fight, well, I said it was a bit more 50-50. I think another thing to think about is that Whyte only had 7 amateur fights. You know, he was obviously a very tough guy. He was around the gyms, you know, sparring all the top pros all the time. But he only had 7 amateur fights. Notoriously, the first one of those amateur fights was against Anthony Joshua. It was Anthony Joshua's third amateur fight when he beat Joshua, you know, and scored a knockdown on the first round. So, you know, it was on the back of that, really, that he managed to barge his way into the pros where he was, you know, fighting nobody great, you know, sort of Hungarian doorman and stuff. And then because of that victory against Joshua, he managed to almost talk his way into fighting Joshua again and wobbled Joshua. People thought this guy is okay. And then he managed to capitalize on that. Even though he was defeated by going on an incredible run of fights and really winning the hearts of fight fans with his guts and his determination and his willingness to fight anyone to get up there. And I think that's showing through in jumping into this immediate rematch. I mean, he was really iced, really knocked out, but he is adamant that he's going to go back in and do it again. Like, and not going to strike twice. He's sticking with the same camp. He's sticking with Xavier Miller and Dave Caldell. He's down in Portugal training. He thinks he's going to turn it around. Can he? Well, like I say, you know, it is always dangerous. Povetkin is always dangerous, and so many people, particularly British fighters, I'm thinking Hughie Fury, David Price, and now Whyte, seem to be waiting for Povetkin to get old, you know, and to take that big scalp. But, you know, he's very canny, he's very experienced, he's very tough. And like I said, you know, Whyte only had 7 amateur fights. Povetkin was a gold medalist and world champion, you know, so, you know, and has only ever lost to Klitschko and Joshua. So the pedigree is amazing. And if you're waiting for him to get old, I mean, you know, Whyte did knock him down twice in the 4th round, but, you know, he's just always dangerous. So I think it makes for a hugely exciting fight. It's a very must-win fight for Whyte. We must remember that. You know, and is Povetkin going to get old in the next 3 months or older than he was? You know, he was showing a few signs of wear and tear in that first fight. I don't know. So again, I think it's almost like we're going in this fight, even with the result of the first fight, with the same thing. I still think it's a 50-50 fight. You know, we're going to see how Whyte, who is a natural warrior, reacts to that situation when Povetkin, like he did in the first fight, will want to shuffle up close to him, you know, and he'll be looking to load up that left uppercut, that left hook, that peachy shot of his. So how Whyte deals with that, does he sort of freeze a little bit, or does he just think, you know, I've worked out how I'm going to deal with that left hand now? We're only going to see on the night, and it'll only really come into force on the night when he's in the real situation. So still a lot of question marks. I still think it's a 50-50 fight. Sorry to repeat myself, but Povetkin is always dangerous. But I am going to say, given Whyte's mentality, you know, his warrior mentality, his absolute must win in this fight, he's going to be super switched on. I think, as his fond of using that phrase, maximum violence, you know, I just think he's going to be that little bit more awake, and I'm going to back Whyte to stop Povetkin in the mid to late rounds in the rematch, wherever it is, on November the 21st. And I'm really looking forward to it. It's a great fight for the heavyweight division. And yeah, Come on, White.